Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From the Royal York Hotel in downtown Toronto, welcome to the 112th season of the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you just joining us either through our webcast, our podcast, or on Rogers Television, welcome to our meeting. Before our distinguished speaker is introduced today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our head table guests. And I'd ask that each guest rise for a brief moment and then be seated as your name is called. I'd also ask the audience to refrain from applauding until all of our head table guests have been introduced. So, starting on your far right, Ms. Antoinette Tumilo, the Executive Vice President, Real Estate Management Services with Colliers International and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. Mr. Scott Travers, President of the Society of Energy Professionals. Ms. Tina Avanitis. Sorry, Tina. Tina Avanitis, the Vice President, Government Relations and Communications with the Ontario Energy Association and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. Mr. Bob Oliver, the Chief Executive Officer, Pollution Probe. Mr. Don McKinnon, the President of the Power Workers Union. And then from your far left, Ms. M.J. Perry, the Vice President and owner of Mr. Discount and a Director of the Empire Club of Canada. Mr. Noah Farber, the Acting President and Chief Executive Officer of the Asthma Society of Canada. Mr. Duncan Hawthorne, the President and Chief Executive Officer, Bruce Power. Ms. Carol Browner, former Director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy and former U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator. And my name is Gordon McIver. I'm the Executive Director of the National Executive Forum on Public Property. Ladies and gentlemen, your head table. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge some VIPs in the room as well. If they would please stand and be acknowledged. We have three MPPs for Ontario. Marie-France Lalonde, the MPP for Ottawa-Orleans, joins us today. Marie-France, welcome. Catherine Fife, the MPP for Kitchener-Waterloo. Welcome to the lunch. Eleanor McMahon, MPP for Burlington. And Dwight Duncan, our former Minister of Energy. There we go. Welcome. So now I wanted to point out as well, ladies and gentlemen, you have question cards on your table, and at the end of this talk, Carol has kindly agreed to take questions from the audience, so please feel free during her speech to write them down, and they will be collected from your table if you just raise your hand up. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Duncan Hawthorne, who is going to do the honors of introducing the speaker today. Duncan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a great pleasure of introducing Carol Browner to you today. We've spent time with her this morning at several meetings, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy hearing her remarks. And I'll go quickly through Carol's very distinguished career. Anyone that knows her background, and I'm sure there's a number in the room, will know how influential she's been in the environmental field in the US. But Carol's a distinguished senior fellow at American Progress, senior counsellor at Albright Stonebridge Group. She also serves on the League of Conservation Voters Board, the Bungie, close enough, Carol. I told you I would mash these words up, didn't I? I told you that. Limited Board of Governors, and Global Ocean Commission and O-Powers Advisory Board. She's also a council member of Nuclear Matters, which is a US-based organisation advocating for the role nuclear plays as part of a balanced electricity supply mix. Who'd have thunk it, eh? Carol most recently served as Assistant to President Barack Obama and Director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy, where she oversaw the coordination of environmental energy, climate, transport and related policy across the federal government. During her tenure at the White House, she secured the largest investment ever in clean energy, established a national car policy that included both new automobile fuel efficiency standards and the first ever greenhouse gas reductions. From 1993 till 2001, she served as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. As administrator, she adopted the most stringent air pollution standards in the US history, set a fine particle clean air standard for the first time, and spearheaded the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act, as well as the Food Quality Protection Act. She's known for working with both environmentalists and industry to set science-based public health protections while providing businesses with important flexibility in how to meet those standards. She worked across the agency to ensure a focus on protecting the most vulnerable, particularly children. In 1991 to 93, she served as Secretary of Environmental Regulation in Florida, where she launched the largest ecological restoration project ever attempted in the United States to restore the natural flow of water to the Everglades. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Carol Browner.
Thank you, Duncan, for that introduction, and let me thank Bruce Power for the invitation to be with all of you today. It's an impressive list of speakers that have stood before you. I am in awe. I had heard about all the U.S. presidents who had come. I had heard about the Dalai Lama spoke. But then you told me that Audrey Hepburn spoke. And I thought, now that's really something. It's just a lot of fun to be here in Canada today and to be with all of you. And to the MPPs who join us here, let me thank you for your government service and for your leadership. I know it is sometimes not the easiest jobs in the world, and so the idea that you give of yourself and you give of your families to help make your community and your country a better place, I thank you for that. And to the head table, I've had the opportunity to be with many of you during the morning. We've had a number of great meetings, and I have to say I have learned an awful lot, so thank you for helping to educate me on all of the amazing things that are afoot here in Canada when it comes to the issue very near and dear to me, the issue of climate change, global warming, reducing carbon pollution. Now, you've heard my resume, and I've had a lot of interesting titles. You heard that I guess I would say interesting and easily misunderstood. I was Secretary of the Environment for my home state of Florida. I actually grew up in Miami, Florida. My parents are Irish immigrants who went to Florida, went to Miami, which is not the normal Irish immigrant path in the United States, but they settled in Miami, and so I launched my career in Florida, where I served as Secretary for the Environment. My husband and I were buying a house, and on the loan application, you have to put down your job title. So I put down Secretary, and because that was my job title. And then I got to income, salary, and I was the head of a large government agency, and it was a nice income, so I put that number down. And the woman processing the form looks at it, she looks at me, and she says, "Honey, how did you get a secretary job paying that much? Where do I go?" And I tried to explain, and but then I moved on, and of course, my next job, as you heard, got me the title of administrator. The head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States is referred to as the administrator. It sounds like you're in charge of the copy machine or whatever. You're certainly not setting pollution standards that affect the entire U.S. economy. There were 15,000 people I got the pleasure of working with, a $5 billion annual budget. Administrator didn't really capture that. As you might imagine, when you run the environmental agency, sometimes people aren't happy with the decisions you make. And one day someone was trying to introduce me as the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, and they wanted to point out that I was the longest serving administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. But instead, they said, and she's the longest suffering administrator of the EPA. It was actually a tremendous honor, and I am so proud to have been able to serve President Clinton as a member of his cabinet for all 8 years of his presidency. My last job in government, I came back after an 8-year break to serve President Obama. He created a new office in the White House, an office on energy and climate change, and I agreed to join him at the beginning of his tenure to help sort of launch the energy and climate change agenda. I was quickly given the title there by the press corps of Energy Czar. My husband did some quick work and announced to me that there were there were czars, they were all men, so therefore I must be a czarina, not a czar, but that I should also be aware that czarinas didn't exist independent of the czars, that all the power was derivative. And so whatever I was doing was derivative of him. One of the more conservative newspapers in our country eventually referred to me as a socialist czarina, which really made you wonder what they understood about history. Apparently not a lot. Today, the title I guess I have is consultant. This almost got me deported last night, I think, when I arrived in Canada. They were curious what the title meant, so I spent some time in a special line, but we worked that one through. But so I'm here. I could have been at the airport. One of my fellow consultants and business partners, Madeleine Albright, likes to tell a little story about consultants. It's a story about a rancher and a stranger. And one day, a stranger drives up to a ranch and the rancher says to the owner, "If I can tell you within 15 minutes exactly how many head of cattle you have, will you let me take the calf standing right over there?" And the rancher thinks for a minute and says, "Okay, why not?" The stranger climbs back into his truck, pulls out a laptop, connects to GPS, studies some satellite photos, comes back to the rancher. The stranger says, "You have exactly 1,149 head of cattle." The rancher looks at him and says, "That's right." The stranger says, "So that means I get the calf," and proceeds to take the calf. The rancher says, "Wait, hold on a second, not so fast. If I can tell you within 5 seconds what you do for a living, you have to give me the animal back, right? That's a deal." And the stranger says, appearing a little puzzled, "Okay, I guess that's fair." Immediately, the rancher declares, "You're a consultant." And the stranger is amazed. He says, "How did you figure that out? How did you know?" And the rancher says, "You came here without being asked. You told me what I already know, and then you charged me for it. Could I please have my dog back?" The consulting world is some of you may be consultants, maybe you can relate to that. It is fun. I enjoy the people I get to work with, the companies I get to work with, the nonprofits I get to work with. And one of the things I do in my current role, as you heard, is I work with a group called Nuclear Matters. And let me just briefly tell you what Nuclear Matters is about. It is a group of leaders in the U.S. Focused on making sure that we preserve our existing nuclear fleet. Now, suffice it to say, when I stand up in front of some audiences as a lifelong committed environmentalist, they're a little perplexed. And the truth of the matter is I wasn't always a proponent of nuclear power. Like many environmentalists, I thought we should look at other alternatives. But about 15 years ago, 12 years ago, I was working on a paper about energy security from a global perspective with a number of fellow Democrats. We were not in office at the time, Madeleine Albright and Susan Rice and others. And in the course of writing this paper on global energy security, it occurred to me that it really wasn't defensible to have my position against nuclear given my position on climate change and global warming and carbon pollution. And so I literally woke up one morning and said, I need to change my position. What is abundantly clear to me is the biggest problem the world faces today, and one that will have many repercussions across all countries and sectors, is the challenge of global warming. And for Nuclear Matters, what is very clear to us is if you take the baseload nuclear power out of the U.S. mix, it's about 20%, almost 20% of our baseload energy supply in the U.S., you will only make it significantly, if not impossible, to achieve a real and sort of more immediate reductions in greenhouse gas and carbon pollution. And so the way I've come to think about nuclear power is it is a carbon-free source of energy, and we can't find ourselves in a situation of sort of digging the hole deeper by closing down nuclear while we're trying to actually achieve greater reductions. Some of the things I've been able to work on focusing in the carbon arena, you heard about the miles per gallon. We worked with California. We worked with the auto industry to set a miles per gallon. I know this isn't going to work for you guys because you do liters, but of 54.5 miles per gallon, and the first ever carbon standards, carbon emission standards for cars and trucks in the United States. There's an interesting little backstory to how we found ourselves doing that at the beginning of the Obama administration. When I was serving in the Clinton administration, one of the very conservative members of our Congress, you may have heard of him, Tom DeLay, he was not a fan of EPAs. He was a Newt Gingrich part of his entourage, and he was nicknamed the Exterminator. And that tells you a lot right there. And he and I got into a very public fight one day over whether or not in 93, 94, EPA was regulating greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pollution. And I became very frustrated, and I said, we're not. And then I went on to say, I'm not even sure we can under the existing law, because the environmental law that we use to regulate air pollution, the Clean Air Act of 1990, doesn't mention the word carbon, climate change, greenhouse gases. So I don't know that we can actually regulate it. And he said, well, why don't you ask your lawyers? And so I did. I went and I asked our lawyers, and being good lawyers, a year later they had an answer. And basically it was, yes, you can. You have broad authority to regulate pollutants that endanger public health and welfare. And so if EPA makes a determination based on science that carbon pollution endangers public health and welfare, then EPA has to regulate. Fast forward, elections happen, parties change, Mr. Obama comes to office, and we begin the job of regulating carbon pollution. Mr. DeLay, the man who asked the question, is no longer in office. He tried a stint at, do you guys get the show Dancing with the Stars? He tried a stint on that. It didn't go very well. But I am quite convinced he doesn't understand or know that if he hadn't asked that question, I wouldn't have asked the lawyers, and there wouldn't have been a Supreme Court decision, or there might not have been a Supreme Court decision actually saying that all of the work that Obama is now doing to reduce carbon pollution is in fact allowable under the existing law. I thought I would just spend a few minutes explaining exactly, so we've done cars and trucks in the U.S., and now we're focused on power plants. The President has put forward a plan to reduce carbon pollution from power plants. And just, some of you are probably not steeped in all the industry power language that we can kind of talk in code. We can have entire meetings and acronyms and understand what each other is saying. But just very briefly, what the U.S. is going to do, or is now doing, will require every state to write a carbon reduction plan focused on the electricity sector. They'll look at the generating capacity within their states, and then what the reductions should be. And then when you aggregate it together, you'll have a national reduction. And there were sort of 4 factors that they looked at in setting targets for each of the states. One is they looked at the coal-fired fleet and basically said, you know what, it could operate a lot more efficiency. So we're not saying you have to make your coal plants more efficient, but we're saying that's an option, and so we'll add that into the calculation. The second thing is they looked at the natural gas turbines. We make an increasing amount of electricity today from natural gas. Similarly, you can make those more efficient. You can run them more often, less carbon polluting. They looked at renewables. Included in renewables were other clean energy sources like nuclear power, and then they looked at efficiency. And these were sort of what they call the building blocks that then gave you a target for each state based on what it's generating, what's the technology available in each of these sectors, coal, natural gas, renewables, efficiency. Each state is free to write whatever plan it wants. It may write a plan that's all about efficiency, not likely, but it could. It could write a plan that's, all about natural gas. Again, not likely, but they could. So there's a huge amount of work going on right now in our states developing the first ever statewide utility, energy, electricity sector carbon reduction plans. And because it's the United States, there's also a lot of litigation going on. The lawyers got to court very, very quickly, and we have this interesting dynamic where I think almost 24 of our states, so 24 states, have sued saying the Obama administration shouldn't be doing this, but at the same time, they're writing plans just in case. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the work that's going on right here, we met with the minister earlier today, looking at things like cap and trade, using those kind of market mechanisms to find the most cost-effective carbon reductions. Those are that's likely to happen in the U.S. We're likely to see those kind of programs utilized. And I know, for example, some of Canada is already working with California, for example, and we may see more and more states working with California and perhaps some of your provinces. So it's a very exciting time. It's a rapidly changing time in the energy sector. We were talking earlier today, I've been involved in various ways in energy production for 20 years. And if 5 years ago we had all been sitting in a room and I or someone in the room had said, well, natural gas is just going to take us by storm, we would have laughed at that person. We were busy completing import facilities, and now in the U.S. we're reconfiguring those to export. So I think it's a dynamic sector. It's hard to really appreciate how quickly it's changing. But we are the whole world is now headed to Paris. Your new prime minister is apparently going with quite a large entourage, which is very good news, headed to Paris to talk about how as a world we reduce our global warming, our carbon pollution. And the exciting thing about this is it's the first time there's been many global meetings on climate change. But this is the first time where coming into the meeting, countries are actually making commitments. So China has put a plan on the table. India has put a plan on the table. The U.S. has put a plan on the table. Because, ultimately, it will take the whole world if we are going to be able to address the challenges of global warming and carbon pollution. And, one of the questions I'm frequently asked is, are you optimistic? It seems so daunting, and it is daunting, but I will say in closing that I am optimistic, and I'm optimistic because I don't think that our generation, all of us here, want to be the first generation to leave to a subsequent generation a problem that can't be solved. And I mentioned the wonderful people I got to work with at EPA, a lot of the best engineers in the country for sure. And even as good as they are, they're not able to reverse sea level rise once we start to experience the consequences, saltwater intrusion into freshwater drinking supplies. And so I think that I am optimistic because I believe we do not want to leave to a subsequent generation a problem that they cannot solve. It will not be easy. It will take a very can-do attitude. It will mean, as in my case, rethinking some of the positions I had previously about certain sectors, about potential solutions, as I did in the case of existing nuclear. But I think that we can get this one right, and it is an honor to be here today with Bruce Power and to be here with all of you to talk about this incredibly important issue. I will just one last note. We have not had a national debate in the United States on climate change. I think candidate Obama, Senator Obama, when he was a candidate for president, would have welcomed that, but his opponent, John McCain, sort of took it off the table by saying, I agree with you, don't worry. But if you haven't tuned into our debates right now in the U.S., one thing you may have missed, and I'd be happy to share with you, is we're about to have a very big debate in the United States on climate change, and it is it is about time. So thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, you're ready for question number one. What role do you think that nuclear will play to enable electric transport?
I hope a lot. Okay, electric transport, if we start to drive more and more electric vehicles, we're going to need electricity, obviously, to power those vehicles. And I think that you don't want to take cars emit carbon pollution and electrify them, but then power them with something that produces carbon pollution. That sort of doesn't, the logic of that doesn't end up working out. And so I think, carbon-free, which nuclear is, obviously wind, solar, others, but nuclear is an existing carbon-free source of energy, and I think it could play a very, very important part in the electrification of our transportation sector.
Okay, here's an interesting one. What is the status prospect of nuclear being recognized as a green supply for the purposes of the EPA Clean Power Plan?
So EPA did speak to, so the Clean Power Plan is the rule that EPA has now, the targets that EPA has set for the 50 states. Well, actually, only 49 states have to write plans. I spend half my time in Vermont. We do not have to write a plan in Vermont because Vermont does not actually produce any of its own energy. It's all imported from other places. So the 49 states, in the instructions to the states, EPA did specifically talk about the role of existing nuclear. It talked about the opportunities for new nuclear. And it talked, what's it, when you increase the capacity, what's it called? Upgrades? Uprates. It talked about uprates, which means you get more electricity out of an existing, more megawatts, more kilowatts out of an existing facility. Because EPA is very, very mindful, given that, as I said before, almost 20% of the U.S. base load, that means the stuff you count on morning, noon, and night, is coming from nuclear. It is almost 60% of our carbon-free energy today. So if you were to start to take nuclear off the table at the very time you're starting to try to reduce your carbon, you'd only make, as I said, the job more difficult. One of the things that EPA did in its final instructions to the states is it allowed states to choose the methodology. This gets a little complicated. The methodology. They can either focus on a rate-based system or a mass-based system. And I think that, I think many in the nuclear industry would say the shift towards mass-based is a very important step. It's when you use a mass-based, you look at all of the emissions, you set a cap, and then you work out the best way to meet that. And what a mass base will do is also encourage more cap and trade systems where you either auction or allocate emission credits, or different names they use, and then find the most cost effective. Just briefly, the original cap and trade program was actually written into the Clean Air Act in the United States in 1990, which was actually signed by Bush 1. It was very much, I think, a sort of a more Republican than a Democratic idea at the time. I had the privilege of really ramping up the implementation when I was running the EPA in the 90s. And the interesting thing is just how efficient it turned out to be. It was in the acid rain program, and so there was a cap on SO2 or SOx, sulfur dioxide emissions, and then there were credits that could be traded back and forth. And so if you owned a facility and you were above the cap, you had the choice of buying credits for that differential, or perhaps installing technology coming below the cap, and then you could actually sell some credits to offset some of your compliance costs. And it ended up really driving down the cost of compliance. And the way we measure that in places like EPA is it's a dollars per ton of emission reduction. So in the case of acid rain, it's how much did it cost for every ton of acid rain taken out of the environment. Long before I was at EPA in the 80s, while this was being debated, the industry, the electric utility industry, did a study that suggested it was going to cost almost $1,000 per ton of carbon, of SO2 reduction. EPA did a study also before I was there that suggested it would be on the order of $600 per ton. The credits have traded, I don't know, as low as, I mean, they've traded under $200 at times. Do you know what the lowest has ever been?
I think it's been just around 100.
Yeah, so it's proven using this market mechanism, so you don't have to install scrubbers on every single facility, but you figure out the ones that really have, you know, a life left in them that warrants this in capital investment, and then allowing companies to sort of work across their fleets or work across a state. This is what we tried to do under President Obama's leadership in getting climate change legislation. We tried very hard to get a cap and trade program building on what, you know, was Bush 1's success only in politics, right? The party that brought cap and trade to the table ended up turning on cap and trade, so we weren't successful. But this is a long way of saying that part of what EPA has done now in setting these state-by-state targets is given states really sort of an option, if you will, under the mass-based approach, which is, I think, preferred by many in the nuclear industry, to set up cap and trade. And I think, you know, the power generation in the U.S., just like here, has changed dramatically. I grew up, as I said, in Miami, and when I was growing up, there was a company called Florida Power and Light. And, you know, they made the electricity, they distributed it, they transmitted it, they sent us a bill, and that's how it worked. And, you know, there was a little, and, you know, today, Florida Power and Light is now next era, and they generate, what, they have facilities in 25 states? Yeah, 25 states. I don't think they do any distribution or transmission anymore. They just make it. And so if I'm running a company like that and I'm now facing requirements to reduce my carbon pollution, I'd like to look at my entire company portfolio and figure out the most cost-effective place to get those reductions, as opposed to having to do it sort of facility by facility or state by state. So I think we're going to see a move towards, which may mean there can be some cap and trade programs that go across the border. That's not impossible already. Toronto is working with California, right? And that may create some other opportunities. So a long way of saying to you that these kind of market mechanisms can be quite effective in finding what I would call the common sense, cost-effective solutions to pressing pollution problems.
Okay, ready for another one? Mm-hmm. Okay, this was in regards to your comment on carbon emissions being considered a pollutant to be regulated. So this person asks, what about methane and natural gas releases being tracked as a pollutant, and what is the impact of that on natural gas extraction?
The answer is yes, no. Okay, a little, so methane is, for those of you who don't follow the intricacies of natural gas or shale gas extraction, when you bring this up, you also get methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. There are actually 6, well, I'm sure the scientists would correct me, but there are a number of greenhouse gases, carbon being one that stays in the environment a very long time, methane being very intense, a very intense one. So regulating methane emissions makes a lot of sense, and in fact, the United States is starting to look at how you would actually regulate methane, because again, you don't want to be reducing one climate change greenhouse gas pollutant and ignoring another. And particularly since we now in the United States make more and more electricity from natural gas, that means we're generating more methane pollution. It's important, and it's not just in the extraction, it's in the transportation, it's in the use of it. I learned a long time ago working in the environmental arena that all of this stuff is just complicated. Taking things out of the ground is just complicated. Burning things has consequences. It doesn't mean you don't do them, but it means you think about what those consequences are and you figure out how to do it in a thoughtful, non-impactive manner. And one thing I will say about the nuclear industry is I give them a huge amount of credit for all of the stuff they've done to ensure safety and the way they work together across the industry around the world to problem solve. And so I wish there was a perfectly safe way to do all of this. There isn't. And what that means is we have to have the right government regulations. Most companies are good actors, but occasionally there's a bad actor, so you need a program in place. You need to enforce that program. It's really unfair to a business who is spending money to achieve environmental, to reduce pollution and be in compliance with environmental law if their competitor is not doing likewise. And so not only do you need the regulations, you need the enforcement, and then you need to recognize that industry frequently knows the best way to get there. It's not a situation where the government should dictate the path to be followed. The government should set a science-based standard, a legal-based standard, and then work with industry and the environmental community to find the smartest way to meet those standards. When we were doing the work on setting the fuel efficiency standards under President Obama at the beginning of his term, the car fuel efficiency standards, one of we had everyone at the table. We had the environmental community, we had the unions, we had the car companies, we had state governments, California. Everyone was at the table. And one of the things that the car companies kept saying to us is, we're about to be in a situation where the U.S. Department of Transportation has one set of requirements for fuel efficiency. EPA has another set for carbon emissions, the state of California. And all of these different requirements, it's going to be very, very costly, and it's ultimately not going to benefit the consumer. I talked to the environmentalists, and they would say, you know what, these are really dangerous pollutants. You need to do more. And so what we were finally able to figure out, and I had learned this during my tenure at EPA, is you need to kind of figure out what each party to the negotiation needs. They don't each need the same thing. Try and give them each a little so you can find the common ground and move forward. The end of the story is we gave the car companies one set of rules, not 3 different rules that were going to bump into each other, in exchange for which we got more environmental benefit. They got certainty and predictability. The consumer got a car that goes further on a gallon of gas than it did previously, and we all got cleaner air to breathe. And that's sort of I think the sweet spot of how you manage government regulations. In that particular case, nobody sued, but that's unusual.
One last one? Mm-hmm. Okay, this one is not from the floor, it's actually from me, but we don't want to let you go without commenting on the biggest energy announcement to come out of the United States in the last week or so as far as Canada is concerned, and that is Keystone. And a lot of people listened to President Obama's declaration as to why he was turning it down, why the United States wasn't going to accept it. But then in the background, we heard a lot about the economics of it, and that it increasingly didn't make a lot of sense economically for the United States to be importing that type of oil, which is more expensive than other types, of which there is a glut now. Do you have a position on that?
Well, I think, again, the energy sector is fast changing, and what economically might have made sense 5 years ago may or may not make sense today, and I'm not an economist, so I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on that. Look, I think the Secretary, John Kerry, Secretary of State, who had sort of authority over this, I think the President, they thought about this very, very carefully, and I think the President, really, obviously they had to, meet all the legal requirements, but I think the President, when he said in the announcement that, while we work to reduce our carbon pollution, bringing more carbon into the atmosphere is not where he wants to be, and, I assume it was a hard decision for some here in Canada, but I think it was a very carefully thought-through decision on behalf of the President and Secretary Kerry. I would hope that our two countries and our governments, as we go forward, can find ways to work together on clean energy, because I think there are incredible opportunities. And, it's obviously, you've just had an election, and I guess perhaps surprised some people in terms of where it ended. As you're well aware, we're about to have an election, but we take a long time in getting there, so we'll be debating for a year who should be our next president. But my strong hope for both of our countries is that we can find ways to work together to create a better future. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Oliver to express our collective appreciation.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank the Empire Club for hosting this event. I want to thank the sponsors, Bruce Power, the Asthma Society of Canada, the Society of Energy Professionals, and the Power Workers Union for sponsoring and making it all possible. It's afforded me the opportunity to meet Ms. Browner in person, and I followed your career for quite some time. I got into the environmental business about 10 years ago, and one of the first things I started working on were fuel efficiency standards for vehicles, and greenhouse gas emission standards is what they eventually evolved into. And Environment Canada, I was working closely with them, they were working closely with the EPA, and that's how I came to know what a policy-making powerhouse the US EPA is. And when we talked about you're presiding over the implementation of the most stringent North American air quality standards, frankly, they were the world's most stringent air quality standards, and they still stand that way. So I think it's good that you're here in Canada, because I think it's through this type of cross-border collaboration, this North American approach to climate change and clean energy strategy is going to serve us much better than, and I think perhaps the Keystone example is a good warning of how things can go off the tracks if we don't take the time to really ensure we've got principled dialogue and a good relationship to anchor those discussions going forward. A couple of remarks I wanted to make on your words. First of all, your anecdote about being referred to as a secretary. You know, obviously in government, secretary, administrator, these are high-powered titles, and of course the inverse is true in most people's work life, and that can lead to some interesting confusion. And I just wanted to share maybe a similar anecdote. Our former Prime Minister, Joe Clark, who we refer to as the Right Honorable Joe Clark. He was explaining to me once that he kept on getting a series of confusing phone calls from a telemarketer, I think it was, who kept on looking for Mr. Artie Hahn. Artie Hahn, is Artie Hahn there? RT, right, Hahn, honorable, right? And anyway, it took years before I think you figured that one out, but that's why we need to be talking. I'm going to have a difficult time. You're going to have to give me a little bit of time to get to the point where I can actually congratulate Tom DeLay for the greenhouse gas emission regulations. I will get there. I will get there because I'm going to follow the evidence. Right? The evidence says he did it. I'm good with that. And that is one of the things that I did find most poignant about your remarks, Ms. Browner. When we commit to science-based and evidence-based policymaking, that's a courageous step because what you described in terms of your transformation is a commitment, or I guess it's a triumph of science over ideology. We always come with our biases and our ideologies to these issues, but we have to be willing to confront the realities and see where that leads us. It's not always comfortable, but I think we have to believe that evidence-based policy at the end of the day is where we want to go, and I think your work with the EPA and your transformation of that department into a very strong and sound science and legal-based institution is not only serving the U.S. very well, but it served Canada tremendously well. And I hope that, notwithstanding your reference to being a consultant, that we can continue to consult with you in the years to come. The state-by-state climate change approach to creating the national climate change strategy is also something that I believe our current federal government is committed to in terms of working with each of the provinces to develop a comprehensive strategy. So I'm certain there's much we can learn from you, as I have learned over the years, and I look forward to the next visit you have up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks again to our speaker. Absolutely wonderful speech, and quite something to have our second President Obama advisor in this season already. It's amazing. Thank you again to our generous sponsors today. As Bob mentioned, the Asthma Society of Canada, Bruce Power, Pollution Probe, Power Workers Union, and the Society of Engineer Professionals. Also like to point out that, and I'm sorry I forgot her before, but Karina Gould, the MP for Burlington, is in the room. So glad you could join us today. Thank you. We'd also like to thank the National Post, which is our national print media sponsor, and Rogers Television, our television broadcaster. Also, a big thank you to MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, for live webcasting today's event at the global level. Follow us on Twitter at Empire_Club, and also look us up on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. You'll find that we have a lot of very interesting programs over the coming weeks. We hope you'll join us. Next week, we're welcoming our third Premier, Canadian Premier this season, Premier Brad Wall, Premier of Saskatchewan, who will be at the Arcadian Court. Following that, we've got the head of CBC Television coming to talk about what next for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. That's Heather Conway, who will be with us on November 20th, also at the Arcadian Court. The Governor of the Bank of Canada will be here on December the 8th at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre talking about Canada's economic outlook for the next year. And that will be followed at the beginning of the next year, a very first event in 2016, with our Financial Outlook Lunch on January 5th, right here at the Royal York Hotel. Finally, we just booked Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin for next June 3rd, who will be talking to us about the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Government of Canada. Imagine her speech has been recently changing. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance today. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.